tell you a little secret about Dave Register. Maybe some of you have the same problem. I can't sleep on airplanes. So when I take a long trip, I can't sleep. I just kind of toss and turn, and I've always been envious of looking across the aisle and seeing somebody there with their mouth hanging open and snoring and just oblivious, to the world. They're just sound asleep, and they can be that way for 3 or 4 hours. Sometimes when I've taken transatlantic flights, and you're in the air for 11, 12 hours, oh, how you want to sleep on the plane, especially when everybody around you is sleeping. They turn down the lights and everybody's sleeping. So normally what I do, instead of twisting and turning and wishing I could sleep, I usually get a good book and I read. And on the trip back from Texas this time, I had a good book. I like to read historical novels. And I was reading away, and the next thing I knew, I was sound asleep. I didn't believe it. But like I said, I'm suffering from these allergies, and I think that contributed toward me being tired. And I must have slept for about an hour and a half because my seatmate shook my arm and woke me up. And I looked at my watch, and whoa, where's the last hour and a half gone? My book was on the ground. I guess I had fallen asleep while I was reading. And he said, "Can you excuse me, please? I need to go to the restroom. We're about to land." And I couldn't believe it that I had slept most of the flight. That got me thinking about spiritual sleep. Where does spiritual sleep come from? Sometimes we can be distracted or lulled into a spiritual sleep. And I thought about this a little bit in the context of the dedication of the new building in Texas and times in the past. I think I mentioned to you before when our family first moved to Pasadena, California, and my dad enrolled in Ambassador College, I was 8 years old. And the second year we were there, my dad was a sophomore in college, and I was entering the 4th grade. The college was kind enough to let us rent one of the little buildings on the campus for, I think, $50 a month. And it was one of those buildings that was really condemned to be torn down because they were going to build the auditorium there, which they did eventually. So we lived in this little 2-bedroom house. And, when you're there and you look at those resources, you kind of grow inured to the fact that you're on the campus of a college, in the shadow of the work of God that's going on, and you can be lulled into a sense of a lack of appreciation. And I would describe this as a spiritual sleep. Sometimes, if you're away from that, living in a place like Redding or Red Bluff or Walnut Creek, you can be preoccupied with things that you're doing or that I'm doing, work, projects. Linda and I are in the middle of a project of remodeling our condominium, and it can be distracting, no doubt about it. We have a contractor that we asked to keep in touch with us, and Friday I was trying to prepare a sermon, and he was calling me about every 2 hours. I said, "You're the contractor, we're paying you, you do it." But we can get distracted, we can be distracted, we can be lulled into a sense of, and the next thing you know, we've fallen asleep. Kind of like I did on that airplane. Let's go to Matthew 25 and verse 5. Matthew 25 and verse 5. I think we all know Matthew 25 is the parable of the 10 virgins. 5 were considered wise and 5 foolish. I'm not going to take the time to go through the entire parable. I'd just like to read verse 5. Matthew 25, 5. It says, "But while the bridegroom was delayed, they all slumbered and slept. The analogy is very clear that we all spiritually slumber and sleep from time to time. We get into those lulls, we get into those distracting periods of life, and let's face it, we all slumber and sleep spiritually from time to time. The clear analogy in this parable in verse 5 is that the bridegroom is Christ. And how many people have imagined that Christ was delaying his coming? In Matthew 24, Christ said there are some who think Christ has delayed his coming, and they begin to eat and drink with the drunkards, and they are totally distracted from their purpose. That's what I'd like to talk about a little bit today, is the spiritual slumber and sleep that we can sometimes fall into almost unexpectedly, kind of like me on the airplane. You know, I just don't sleep on airplanes. And suddenly I found myself sleeping for an hour and a half, dropping my book on the floor, didn't even notice. You know, I'm sure the flight attendant came by and asked me if I wanted a drink, and I just right through it, you know, missed everything. Now, spiritually, that can happen to all of us, can it? Let me share some headlines with you. These are headlines from a magazine. What is going to happen? Scripture prophesies two great military powers will arise in the last days, one with the revival of the Roman Empire by a federation of 10 nations in the territory of the ancient Roman Empire. The other, Russia, with her allies, possibly China. Let me ask you something. Does that headline strike a familiar chord? It was published in the Plain Truth magazine in 1934. "85 years ago. And yet, somehow, it's relevant today, isn't it? Here's another one I'd like to share with you. A military accord officially lining up Spain with Italy and Germany will add more of the prophesied kingdom, which give their power and strength to the beast. That was written in 1939, just a month before Hitler invaded Poland to start World War II, in the Plain Truth magazine. In 1952, the church wrote in a booklet, "Russia may give East Germany back to the Germans and will be forced to relinquish her control over Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and parts of Austria to make up the coming European Union." 1952. In 1956, that's 69 years ago, the church wrote, "Communist oppression in Eastern Europe is being overthrown. The way is being prepared for a colossal third force in world politics, a European Federation of Nations, which will eventually become more powerful than the United States," unquote. 1956. Pretty remarkable, isn't it? Amazing, I thought when I read those quotes. Amazing accuracy of this understanding about Europe and Asia 85, 80, 69 years ago. Some of us weren't even alive, right, when those words were written. It's kind of interesting. I looked up yesterday a group called the Eurasia Group, and they primarily look at trends within Europe and Asia. And they listed the top risks for Europe and Asia in 2019. Let me just share the top 5 risks that they listed. Number 1 is what they call bad seeds in leadership. bad seeds in leadership. That is, people rising to leadership positions politically that many would consider bad seeds. I think this is very interesting when you consider that while I'm standing here, you're sitting there. Most of you are aware that the European nations are now voting for the 751 members that will represent the European Congress. These votes take place in the 28 EU nations right now over the next 4 days. Started on Thursday, will end Sunday. A number of people are really concerned that some ultra-right populists, even communists and others, may gain a foothold in the new European Congress. Bad seeds is the number one risk, according to the Eurasia Group. The number two risk, the United States and China relations. You know the old adage, when the United States sneezes, the rest of the world gets a cold. We are locked in whether they like to admit it or not, a trade war with China. And because of that, the economies of the entire world are being threatened. And I believe it will rise at some point to the effect that Europe will want to strengthen its own economy to the point it's not subject to the sneezing of the United States or China. And of course, that would play right into some of those prophetic statements we read earlier from publications of years past. Number three risk, according to the Eurasia Group, is cyber hackers. Cyber hackers. I read a book not too long ago, When the Lights Go Out, talking about how cyber hackers can break into computers that control the power grid in countries and nations and corporations. And if they can do that, then they can shut off the power. You know, we think we're living in an advanced technology. You know, we all have computers. We all have, little smartphones. Back in 1969, 70, I used to sell computers. They were the size of Volkswagens. And now I can carry something in my pocket that has more power than that computer that I used to sell for Sperry Univac. Right in my own pocket. But you know, at the end of the day, I got to plug that thing in. Because the battery wears out every day. And I've got to recharge it every day. Well, what happens if the power grid goes down for 3 or 4 days? My smartphone just got dumb all of a sudden, right? Cyber hackers are the third greatest risk to Eurasia, according to the Eurasia Group. Number 4, rising European populism. Rising European populism. And it's primarily based on the huge influx of refugees from Africa and other countries in the Eastern Bloc that are pouring into nations in Europe. And they're concerned. They're very concerned about this influx of refugees. And it was kind of interesting when Linda and I traveled to England last year for the feast. We got a cab from Heathrow Airport to our hotel. And the cab driver was an Englishman, but all the way to the hotel, he kept complaining about the minority refugees who were coming in, taking over the taxi business in England. He just couldn't stop complaining about it. The whole trip, about all these refugees, And I didn't dare tell him that I was a refugee once, right? Our parents came over from England, they escaped and came to this country several generations ago in my family, but we're all European refugees at some point, most of us anyway. So number 4 is the European rise in populism, nationalism. And once again, I think viewing the results of this European vote, for the European Parliament over the next few days will be very interesting. And number 5, the instability of U.S. politics. The number 5 risk to Europe, according to the Eurasia Group, is the instability of U.S. politics. The potential impeachment of the U.S. president, the inability for the partisan parties to work together. Like I said before, because these economies in Europe and other places in the world depend very heavily on the American economy. And as I forget who the politician was, but may have been Ronald Reagan, he was asked why people voted him in the office, and he said something like, "It's the economy, stupid." The economy is what drives the world. I don't know if you've noticed, but Russian President Vladimir Putin has had several meetings with officials from China and North Korea in this past year. He is clearly trying to isolate the U.S. from Asia. Russia has aligned themselves with Syria and Iran in the Middle East. We all know that. Russian President Putin has also called on European nations to abandon NATO and force the U.S. out of the European alliance. Russia flexes its muscles, but it's really kind of interesting that I looked up the GDP for Russia. It is $1.28 trillion, the gross domestic product, compared to the U.S., which is $18.1 trillion. Russia's economy is about 10% the size of the United States. It's only 10%. And yet when Russia flexes her muscles, she appears to be bigger than the United States. I also looked up, Russia spends about $61 billion a year on military budget. That's 15% of what the United States of America spends. We spend $750 billion on our defense budget. And yet, when Russia kind of flexes her muscles and Russia goes in as an irritant to places like Syria when we're fighting on the other side, it makes them look like an equal partner. And that's exactly what Vladimir Putin wants it to appear like. China only spends $180 billion a year on military spending. That's 20% compared to the United States military budget. The church has not always known all the details or had the timing exactly right, but the church has understood the prophetic framework for a unified Europe for over 85 years. How? Where did this understanding come from? Let's go to Amos chapter 3. Back to the prophet Amos, chapter 3, verse 7. Amos 3:7. If you're still looking, it's page 1059. Amos 3, verse 7. The prophet Amos said, "Surely the Lord God does nothing unless he reveals his secret to his servants, the prophets. A lion has roared. Who will not fear? The Lord God has spoken. Who can but prophesy?" Most of us have probably gone to a zoo, and perhaps you've been fortunate enough to hear a lion roar. It's a scary thing. Our little dogs wake up in the middle of the night sometimes growling and whining because we have coyotes in our community, and you hear the coyotes yapping in the background, and that scares our little dogs to death. Certainly discourages Linda from taking a walk in the middle of the night with the puppies when she knows the coyotes are out there. You talk about something to wake you up if you're out walking at night and you hear a coyote nearby yipping away, and usually they run in packs, so several of them start yipping. That'll wake you up, right? What wakes us up from our spiritual slumber? God said that he would reveal his prophetic secrets to the prophets. How do we know what we know about prophecy? We know from the prophets. Who are the prophets? Daniel and Jesus Christ, who revealed. Daniel and Revelation together begin to put this picture together very clearly for us. You know, not too long ago, somebody asked me, do you believe that Mr. Armstrong was a prophet? And I said, well, you know, I grew up in Pasadena from the time I was 8 years old. And I heard Mr. Armstrong preach a lot of times. And I often heard him say, from his own lips, I am not a prophet. So I believed him. And I still believe him. There are some people who claim that he was a prophet. I don't think so. He always denied it. How do we know these things? From the prophets of God. And there are a few in here, aren't there? They call them minor and major. And then there's some prophecies in the New Testament I think we can hang our hats on. How did the church know in the 30s, in the 50s, in the 60s? How do we know today what's going to happen? At least a framework in rough numbers, in rough national identities, by the prophets who have spoken to us. And why did God speak through prophets? To wake us from our slumber. To wake us from our slumber. To kind of shake us once in a while, unless we grow just too hardened and inured that we no longer can be awakened from our slumber. Let's go to the book of Daniel. Another one of, as I mentioned, great prophets that reveals a timetable of events to occur in the future. In the next, our watch is gone. The clock is gone. It's divine providence. I can speak as long as I want. Relax. I was going to tell you that in the 20 or 30 minutes that I have left, I'm going to go through the book of Daniel, all 12 chapters. No, just joking. But let's notice Daniel 12. Let's jump right to chapter 12, verse 8. Daniel chapter 12 and verse 8. You're not intending to wear that on your wrist, are you, Phil? You're not intending to wear that clock on your wrist, are you? Okay, good. That could hurt after a while. Daniel chapter 12, verse 8. Although I heard, Daniel wrote, I did not understand. And then I said, my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? You know, what's going to happen at the time of the end? The age-old question. And he said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end, till the last generations of the earth. Many shall be purified and made white and refined, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. And that wisdom comes from God's Spirit, leading us to read these prophecies and beginning to understand. And Daniel's prophecies cover a number. I don't have time to go through Daniel 2, but it talks about, the 4 world ruling empires. Talks about this beast that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream. The head was Babylon. The breast and the arms were the Medo-Persian Empire, which would come later, identified in Daniel 5. Then came the Greek Empire in Daniel 8, pictured by the belly and the thighs of this man, this statue. And the legs and the feet were the Roman Empire. And all of these things were prophesied 500 years before the Roman Empire came into existence. And Daniel wrote about it. But he said, look, I don't understand. What is this? you reveal to me what the man was all about, this big man that Nebuchadnezzar saw, but I don't understand. But we have the blessing now of looking back on history and understanding, don't we? We understand those four world-ruling empires and that they were pictured by this big statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw. We understand that because, again, it has been revealed at the time of the end by God's Spirit. As is mentioned here, the wise spiritually shall understand. Let's go to Daniel 11, verse 40. It's across the page in my Bible. Daniel 11, verse 40. We're breaking into this, the longest prophecy in the Bible. It's called the prophecy of the king of the north and the south. And we understand this to be a military and political giant in the north, or Europe, and in the south would be down towards South Asia and the Middle East. Verse 40, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him. Can any of you think of a country in this world that is an antagonist to the Europeans, and I might add even the Americans? Has anybody ever heard of Iran? Has anybody been watching the news the last 2 weeks? Seen the evidence of Iranian frogmen going under oil ships? Putting underwater bombs on the bottom of those ships and ripping open the bottom of them so that oil leaks out, hoping that maybe they'll sink them? What country is setting up military bases within 50 miles of the Israeli border in Syria with missiles and airplanes? At the time of the end, the king of the south. Again, we don't know exactly who it is, but there's some strong indication that it might be a confederation of countries. Who supports the Iranians and the Syrians now? The Russians. Am I right or wrong? Well, I mean, we all know current politics. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, that is, push at these nations to the north, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, with many ships, and he shall enter the countries and overwhelm them and pass through. It's announcing a time when this military might in the north will just have enough of the king of the south constantly pushing and irritating and antagonizing, and we will come down into the Middle East and put an end to it. Verse 41, he shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries will be overthrown. I don't know about you, but oftentimes when I read prophecy, it wakes me out of my spiritual slumber. And I go, hey, these things are coming to pass. These things are happening. Not just words that were written 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. These words have meaning for you and me. It's revealed to us at the time of the end through the prophets that we find here. Let's go to Daniel 12, verse 1. At that time, Michael shall stand up, one of the great angels who's identified by name, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as was never since there was a nation. A time of trouble. I looked up some numbers. In World War II, 50 million people lost their lives. 50 million, you think about that. Another 35 million were wounded and disabled. Today, it is estimated there are now more than 68.5 million refugees who have been fleeing their countries, primarily from military conflicts. That is the greatest number of refugees since World War II. Today, 2019. Our nation is not being flooded with that many refugees. So it gives us the tendency to think, well, it's not happening in my backyard. We complain, about people coming from Central America in relatively small numbers compared to what Europe is experiencing right now. 68 million refugees. These are people who are driven from their homes and forced into a life of camping along the road, trying to find a home somewhere else where they can make a living, where they can afford to eat. The future conflicts that will occur while you and I are living in the next few years will affect more than those millions of people. The problem is not going to get any better, it's going to get worse. Let's go to Revelation chapter 17. Revelation 17. Revelation 17, verse 12. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as of yet. It's kind of interesting, many, many years ago we were looking at Europe and we were saying, 10 nations will probably come up and this will be the new united Europe and this will be the beast power. And of course now there's 28. Soon to be 27 as of October, right? Unless Britain gets their Brexit act together. And we're saying, well, what happened? Did God forget counting? There's 28. Well, it's interesting. The number 10 represents a completion of trial, a completion of a test. Remember what God said to the Israelites when they were coming out of Egypt in Numbers? He said, these 10 times you have rebelled against me. The number 10 is representative of a certain measure of the completeness of a test or a trial. He said, you tested me 10 times. It's really interesting when you look at commentaries, because I was preparing a sermon on this for the Days of Unleavened Bread. But I found that the commentaries, they argue against each other or with each other about what are these 10 times? What were they? Well, I don't think that you can really take it literally, because there were a lot more times than that when you examine the book of Numbers and you find the Israelites rebelled against God a lot more than 10 times. 10 was just a number to represent a completeness of the trial. So I wouldn't be too quick to just hang my hat on to say, well, somehow the 28 nations have to get down to 10 and then that will be the beast power. I think it's more representative of nations joining together in a completeness to make a unified, as it goes on to say, body of nations that will form the beast power at the time of the end. But they receive authority for 1 hour, it's only a short time, as kings with the beast. These are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. So whatever the lead nation is, and very likely a lead personality who's from that nation, they will give their military might, they'll give their political ammunition to this power at the time of the end, the beast power. It's kind of interesting. On October 23rd, 1972, I remember where you were then. October 23rd, 1972. Most of us were probably at the Feast of Tabernacles. But Der Spiegel, the German magazine, wrote, "The European common market is the successor of the Holy Roman Empire." Quite a statement. Now, the Church of God has been saying that for 90 years. And suddenly Der Spiegel writes about it, October 23rd, 1972. A new empire will grow large and influential. The new Roman Empire will become the new economy, Let's notice Revelation 18 and verse 3. Revelation 18 and verse 3, again, it's across the page from where we were reading. Revelation 18, verse 3, for all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxuries. A powerhouse economy is coming in Europe. And why is it going to be built up? Because they can't trust the United States. They can't trust the Chinese. Those are the headlines today. And this new economy that's going to come forth from Europe is going to be incredible. It says the nations of the world marvel at the abundance of her economy. In verse 4, and I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. For her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. There are plenty of things to watch, aren't there? For us to think about, for us to muse about, to wake us out of our slumber spiritually. Let's go to Mark 13. Mark 13, verse 33. Mark 13, verse 33. This is what Christ said from the Mount of Olives, Mark 13. Let's begin in verse 32. Mark 13, verse 32. Mark 13 is the parallel to Matthew 24 and Luke 21. But of that day and hour no one knows. People have tried to guess, but Christ clearly said nobody really knows. Not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And then verse 33. Take heed, watch, and pray, for you do not know when the time is. You don't know when the time is. Now, this word watch is pretty interesting. According to Wycliffe's rendering, he translates it this way. See, wake you, and pray you. An emphatic statement. See, wake you and pray you. Like somebody's waking us out of a sleep. Like the poor man next to me on the airline who had to go to the bathroom. You know, he shook my arm. Hey! He said, let me out. I have to go to the washroom before we land. See, wake you and pray you. The word, of course, is derived from the Greek, to hunt, for sleep, to be restless. The picture is one in pursuit of sleep, and therefore wakeful, restless. Kind of like I usually am when I'm on an airline and I can't sleep, tossing and turning in my chair, trying to get comfortable, trying to sleep. And then somebody comes along and says, hey, wake up! That's the analogy that Christ is giving here. Take heed, watch, and pray. For you don't know when the time is, but we know it's coming. And we know the basic framework. God has revealed that through the prophets in the Bible. We know that it is coming. God has revealed it to his people. Let's go to Daniel 2, verse 44. Daniel 2, verse 44, there's a fifth kingdom. We talked earlier about the four kingdoms represented by the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream, but there's a fifth kingdom. Why do we need to wake spiritually? For this fifth kingdom, because we all want to be part of that kingdom. That is the kingdom of God. And it will follow the rise of this fourth kingdom prophesied, the resurrection of the Roman Empire. Let's read Daniel 2, verse 44. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom. In the days of these 10 kings he talked about earlier, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. The reason God wants us to stay awake and to be awake and to pray for thy kingdom to come is that we want to be in this kingdom. That's our goal. Christ said, pray thy kingdom come. We know there are a number of events that have to occur before that fifth kingdom arises, but that's the one we want to be a part of. So, brethren, let's remember to stay awake and be watchful. God has revealed to his church the framework of end-time prophecy. We don't know all the details, but we do know this. It is God's true church that will understand and see these events coming before they happen, but only if we stay awake spiritually.